Okay. All right. I want to welcome everyone to this class on the Noahide laws. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this class on the Noahide laws. We are going to start a new topic. We spoke about the holidays for a while. We spoke about kashrus, about Aver min achai, eating a limb from a live animal, and all those practical ramifications. Right. So we want to going to speak now about the life cycle and speak about everything that has to do with life and death. No pun intended. From basically from birth to death, and we'll start with birth, dating and marriage, acceptable marriage partners, and all that. Who you're allowed to marry, not allowed to marry. Genders, right? Always a hot topic right now. Gender issues. And modesty, right? Modesty in general. So what do we have? The laws, these Noahide laws, it's forbidden to be sexually immoral. Right? Sexual immorality is forbidden. We're going to see why. Because we spoke before that if you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 16, right, it says over there, let's just see that. What does it say over there? Genesis chapter 2, verse 16 tells me, I find it here. That's what eating from the tree of knowledge. I'm not so sure what the connection here is. Anyway, the Noahide laws are phrased in the negative, but they're also positive aspects. So when it comes to immorality, so what are we looking at over here? It's the idea that we don't want immorality. We want purity over here. So we're going to discuss who a person's allowed to marry. We're not allowed to marry. And what is forbidden or not. Because we've seen by the 7 Noahide laws, they are families of laws, not necessarily prohibitions in and of themselves. So here if you say, well, you know what? You're not allowed to be sexually immoral. Well, that's extremely broad. What about subdivisions? What about definitions? Torah, as we understand, is a law book. Right? It's a law book. It doesn't give you definitions. That's why we need oral law. Spent 2 weeks on Tanakh Talk speaking against the Canaanites. Right? They only believe in, strict interpretation of the Torah, no oral law. I mean, even though they probably have their own, rabbis, quote unquote, their own oral law itself. Because they're going to have to come up with answers because we have no definitions. So they're unique because there are many examples of what is good, acceptable behavior, what is not. Now, if you look at before the flood, what does the Torah tell me? The Torah tells me that the land was corrupt before God. All flesh was corrupted. The Talmud says in Sanhedrin 57a, Talmud tells me there's a brisa, a Talmudic source of the Academy, Rabbi Yishmael, that taught anywhere the term corruption is used, right? It says the land was corrupt before God. What's it a reference to? Sexual matters or idolatry. You have Sodom and Gomorrah, no greater immorality than that. You got the abominations of Egypt, right? Because the Torah tells me, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 3, do not commit the deeds of the land of Egypt, where you shall dwell, right? Where you dwelt. Even though someone's going to say, come on, that has to do with what? That has to do with Jews. But the Torah and the Midrashim say that the deeds that Egypt did were abominations. So we stay away from them. So many commentaries explain, well, who's that referring to? Who's that referring to? Is that talking about Jews or non-Jews? Right? We understand why it should be talking about Jews. 100%. But it could be applying to non-Jews. See, a lot of things, you have to go through the Torah itself. That's why it makes, these classes not so easy. Even though, we spell out everything over here. And the reason is because you see what the Torah says. What's the obvious question? Does this apply to non-Jews? Some things will apply to non-Jews. Maybe not in the exact same way. Right? Some things will not apply to non-Jews at all. One of the things I gave over today, one of my favorite things, when we spoke about kashrus, is that there's these super duper Noahides who want to keep kosher, right? Who want to eat clean animals. And I brought down one of the commentaries in Leviticus chapter 11 that says a non-Jew is not going to keep something that has no benefit to them, right? So the commentary says non-Jews eat all kinds of things, creepy crawly things, etc. Didn't cause them damage, maybe except for eating the bats in Wuhan, right? That might be a different issue, right? But in general, you see, non-Jews eat all kinds of things, not affected. So one of the commentaries says, if that's true, why would a non-Jew do it? Why would they keep it? No benefit. For a Jew, there's a benefit because the Talmud brings down that what causes us to be apathetic. If we eat non-kosher, it causes us to be apathetic. Right? It dulls the soul. Doesn't apply to a non-Jew. Right? The question, though, is maybe science hasn't proven it. And even if science hasn't proven it, so what? Right? It doesn't really matter. So a lot of things science hasn't proven. Doesn't mean it's not true. And science is only briefly discovering what's out there. Like a drop in the bucket to what's out there. So we have another thing. We got the behavior of the Canaanites. It says the deeds of the land of Canaan, where I should bring you, do not do. Neither shall you walk in their statutes. Right? Leviticus chapter 18, verse 3. And it says, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 10 to 12, that if there should not be among you one who assesses his sons or daughter through the fire. Right? That's Molech, the idol Molech. They used to put children, through the fire. Either walk on fire or put them through the fire, so to speak. One who uses divinations, illusionists, an augur, or a sorcerer, because of these abominations. Show me God is banishing them from before you. So again, you can't do idolatry over here, divinations, sorcery. That's called an abomination. So what is the Torah? What does the Talmud tell me? Sanhedrin 56b, Talmud says, God will not punish the nations unless he had warned them against such acts. Got to warn first. Right? The implication is not always clear, so we have to see. But a non-Jew, in order for it to be forbidden, they have to be warned. Don't do this, don't do that. There has to be a warning. Right? If there be no warning, it wouldn't be fair. Right? We're not just going to zap non-Jews for no reason. Got to have a reason. But they have to be warned. That's the point. They have to be warned. Now, let's take a look at the Canaanites. Torah tells me in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 3, list of Jewish prohibited relationships, right? And we happen to read all these on Yom Kippur. On the afternoon service of Yom Kippur, we read the beginning of Leviticus chapter 18. All these forbidden relationships. But also says, you shall not commit the deeds of the land of Egypt, wherein you dwelt. Likewise, the deeds of the land of Canaan, where I'm going to bring you. Don't do it, neither shall you walk in their statutes. Now, the Torah goes on to list relationships over here that are forbidden to Jews. You go look at verses 6 to 24, Leviticus chapter 18. So the Canaanites lost their land to the Jewish people for what reason? Immorality. Sexual immorality. And the land was defiled. Therefore I visited my iniquity upon them. The land vomited out its inhabitants. God destroyed them. Therefore you should keep my statutes, my ordinances, and things that don't make sense. Right? Whether they make sense or not. You should not do any of these abominations. Neither the native born nor the converts. These abominations have been committed by the men of the land who came before you, and the land is defiled. Right? Leviticus chapter 18, verse 28. Now, if you go back, you go to Leviticus chapter 18, verse 3, it says the deeds of Canaan. Now, what does that mean? Seemingly everything listed from verses 6 to 24. Right? In other words, the abominations committed by Canaan. That's what I would think. All these verses talk about immorality is going to apply to those of the deeds of Canaan. Now, if we're going to say that's true, then all the relationships mentioned in those verses are prohibited to Noahides, prohibited to non-Jews. If we say nay, we say no, then you can't assume that. Right? So there's going to be a whole question. There's going to be a whole question over here. And that is, do all these verses, when it says the relationships of Canaan, the deeds of Canaan, in all these relationships, $1.5 million question is, do they apply to non-Jews or not? Comes along the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Talmud says in 56b, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10 to 12, the number of prohibitions. Right? Also forms of sorcery, divination. And also the reason Canaan was driven from the land. Now, the Talmud's going to say God's not going to punish these nations unless he warned them. Now let's keep in mind. First video I ever did on Tanakh Talks, controversial issues, was about homosexuality. It's about 6 months late after a gay bar in Miami was shot up, which, we were 6 months late, to the chase, so to speak. But okay. Right, so there, when I spoke about homosexuality, somebody in the chat mentioned, there's a verse over there that speaks about sorcery and divination. Now, 23 out of these 24 verses speak about immorality, sexual immorality. Who you're not allowed to be with. There's one verse that speaks about sorcery. Now, what would I think? That there's the position of verses for a reason. Right? There are reasons the verses come out the way they do. I'll give an example. At the end of the book of Exodus, talks about the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And all the measurements, the loops, the bars, the boards. The beginning of chapter 37, it says you got to keep Shabbos. Well, I already know I have to keep Shabbos. That's already Exodus chapter 19. It's already Exodus chapter 20. So what are you telling me? All the boards, the loops, and all that. And Shabbos, what's the juxtaposition? The Rashi there says, what the juxtaposition is? Anything that was done in the tabernacle, anything that was done in the Mishkan, is going to be forbidden on Shabbos. It does not supersede Shabbos. So we understand there's a juxtaposition of verses. So someone claimed, all these verses of immorality. Just so happens by the verse of homosexuality, it talks about sorcery. So they said, see, there's a juxtaposition of verses. So it must be homosexuality was an idolatrous practice, and it's only forbidden by idolatry. Interesting idea. What's the problem? Why would I say that's not true? It's a bad deduction. Because 23 out of the 17 out of the 18 verses over there are talking about immorality. 100% they're talking about immorality, forbidden relationships. If that is true, you can't say, okay, I got a verse about sorcery and the next verse about homosexuality, so therefore there's a connection. And it must be homosexuality only applies if you do sorcery or idolatry. Now again, I hear the question. But if I have 23 out of 24 verses talking about immorality, How in the world can I say this one is what we call an exception? It's not talking about immorality. But even if it's not talking about immorality, you're going to tell me I'm going to uproot 23 verses and say that's the direct connection. Well, that's not so easy to say. I got 95% of all the verses, right? Let's just do the math so someone doesn't hammer me over here, right? 95.8%, 96% of the verses in Leviticus chapter 18, the beginning, are talking about sexual immorality. I got one verse that's an exception. So now, how could the next verse that's also talking about immorality, how can that only be done with sorcery or idolatry? Doesn't make sense. I got 96% chance that that's what the topic is. Right? Okay, we have to understand what the verse is doing there. But to take it out of context and to say it only applies by homosexuality, that's, all these sexual, immoral things, forbidden relationships, that verse has to be explained. But you can't say it only has to do with homosexuality. That's the connection. Come on. That'll make a whole lot of sense. In any case, I digress. The Gemara says God's not going to punish these nations unless he warned them against such acts. But there's always a but. What's the but over here? Things are not that simple. The Gemara in Sanhedrin 56b tells me there are relationships mentioned in the list that are elsewhere defined as permitted to Noahides. Right? In other words, there are relationships that are permitted according to this list. But if I look at the list in verses 6 to 24, it cannot be telling me prohibited Canaanite practices. Why? Because if they were totally prohibited to Noahides, what do I do with the other verses that say it's okay? Right? If they're not permitted, these other verses should also not be permitted. And that's not true. Not only that, not all of the Tanaim, right, the earlier rabbis of the Talmud, are going to agree. They don't agree to this idea that God's not going to punish the nations unless he warned them. Who says he has to warn them? Right? In other words, a non-Jew, if they desecrate the 7 Noahide laws, technically a Jew could go and shoot them, kill them. No warning. For a Jew, you got to be warned. For a non-Jew, no warning. You don't have to warn them. Why would I? Because these things are obvious. They're universal. Right? Why do I have to give a warning over here? Why do we say over here, God wouldn't punish the nation unless he warned them? Who says? Difference of opinion over here. Because if that's true, why did the Torah appear to list these relations as prohibited abomination? Either they're all forbidden or they're all permitted. Right? What's going on over here? So, the Torah itself, there are many references to what is not acceptable for Noahides, either based on ancient practices, right? We have precedents. But you can't necessarily say or take them at face value. So now we're going to have to see why. Right? We're going to have to try and understand why. Maybe, now the characters are going to jump up and down because they're going to say, what do you mean? You take it at face value. But how can I take it at face value? Problematic over here. Right? Because if I take it at face value, there's contradiction. Major contradiction. Now, there are a number of categories here. First of all, the relationships that are biblically forbidden. We're going to see what the verse is. There are relationships prohibited by decrees of ancient Noahides, i.e. shame. That there are a few relations, even though permitted by the Torah, were prohibited later by ancient Noahides in their courts. So we're going to see also how they're allowed to do that. People are going to say, what about the Torah? How can they make up their own laws over here, so to speak? Because they were prohibited by ancient Noahides and their courts. Where do they derive the power to do that? Through dinim, making law courts. Now, a few of these decrees apply also today. Others do not apply, or application not so clear. There's a third category. And that is, it's permitted, but we don't do it. So the Torah can refer to a number of relationships, as the Torah says, as abomination, even though technically they're permitted to Noahides. Maybe they are permitted. So why is the Torah called an abomination? The question is, does it apply that only abominations according to us, according to the viewpoint of Jewish mitzvahs? Or is it saying they're abominations even by non-Jews, even by Noahides? So the problem is this word abomination. What does abomination mean? It means that it's repulsive. It's disgusting. Socially, morally, emotionally. And it goes above the law over here. Right? You're not going to discuss it when we're talking about law. Right? That wouldn't make sense. But if it's based on a social judgment, or even an emotional reaction, then the act must have been considered repulsive, even before it was prohibited by law. In other words, what do I see? Called an abomination either it's a social issue, a moral issue, could be both, could be emotional, could be just disgusting in general. Right? So in any of these cases, it's probably most likely going to be repulsive before it's prohibited. Before the Torah says it's prohibited. But there are many acts called abominations. You see Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 to 24. They're not prohibited to Noahides. So we see that they're permitted. Now, even if they're permitted, who says I'm allowed to do them? Who says they should be practiced? Right, so we're going to see how these, it gets complicated here a little bit. So we're going to have to see how this applies. So if you look at the basis of subdivisions, it says in Genesis, right, that a man shall cling to his father and mother, shall leave his father and mother, cling to his wife, they shall become one flesh. Right, that's Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Now, there are 5 prohibitions here that the Gemara learns, that the Talmud learns over here, for the generations or descendants of Adam. One is, it says, a man shall leave his father. It comes on the Talmud and says, what does it mean to leave his father? It means you can have relations with it. Or, what does it mean that his father's current or former wife? So this applies for all time, even when one's father has died or divorced a woman. In other words, leaving his father means he can't have relations with his wife even after his father dies. Right? Even if it's father's wife. Right? So the Rambam, Laws of Kings, chapter 9, halacha 6. Now, what makes this woman prohibited? She's prohibited to the son, or the son to her, either way, because she and the father have a bond. They have formed a bond of what? Of marriage. That bond creates the prohibition. So if the father dies, the son cannot marry his wife. And that we'll see. Now it says, and cling to his wife. Man shall leave his father and mother. What does it mean, and his mother? Similar reasoning. Incest between a man and his mother, forbidden. Also, the prohibition of relations between a man and his biological mother is prohibited, even if the woman was never actually married to the man's father. Right? I don't need a formal act of marriage. Over here, Noahides, remember, can live together. That's marriage. I don't need a formal document. Right? So therefore, if it's his mother by birth, she never married his father, so what? They're still considered his mother. So even if he's never married, father never married this woman, son can't have relations with her. Then the Torah says he's going to cling to his wife. His wife, and not to the wife of another man, i.e. adultery. Forbids adultery between a man and a woman who is another man's wife, right? Clear-cut definition. Adultery means two people are married and one has a fling with the other spouse. So it's based on what's the bond? Marriage, which we're also going to explain. Now, polygamy technically is permitted to Noahides as it is for Jews. But more than 1,000 years ago, it was banned. Right? We don't have polygamy today. And then we'll see also. But again, even technically it's off the books right now. We still don't do it. Now it says to his wife, cling to his wife. What does it mean to his wife? Another prohibition. Forbids male homosexual relations. Right? Relationships. Because it says clings to his wife, not another man. Wife being of female gender precludes the relationship between male and a male. Now, the Torah tells me in the book of Leviticus chapter 18, homosexual act is forbidden. True? Makes it clear. But over here, right, here's an inference. Very simple inference. It says to his wife means not to another man. Lesbianism also forbidden. Even though it's not derived from this verse, per se, it's still forbidden. What's the source? Not so clear. Not so clear. Some say it's a subcategory of male homosexuality. Others say it's because of one of the abominations practiced in Egypt. Right? In combination with a number of other, some other concerns as well. Could have been an earlier decree as well. Right? A number of possible reasons, but everyone agrees lesbianism is going to be forbidden. Now, the Talmud indicates granting civil recognition to homosexual unions, equating them with marriage prohibited for Noahides. Now, this is a major problem. This is a major problem. This is what Mr. Obama did, right before he left office. Same-sex marriages, okay. The Gemara in Chulin 92b says that Ula laments the non-Jews of his time were sunk into the grossest forms of idolatry and immorality. But he praised them for retaining three practices. They did not write a marriage contract for homosexual unions. They did not sell flesh in the marketplace. Unclear. Not exactly clear what this is. Despite all their idolatry and immorality, they still showed respect for Torah. Now, I'll mention one other thing. It's brought down. I'm not exactly sure the source. I think it's a medrash that says that if you're in a place where they write a marriage contract for homosexual unions, that place is going to be utterly obliterated. It's going to be destroyed. Thank you, Mr. Obama. Right? So there is such a medrash. I think it's a medrash that says that. So any place that is going to sanction legally, not just they do it, whatever, legally, with a marriage document, right? Forget legally. They do it with a marriage document. That place will be destroyed. Now again, for Noahides to be married, we're going to see. We mentioned before, all they have to do is live together. They want to get divorced, they walk away. It's what they call in America common law marriage, right? Which not every state upholds. And the last thing here is, fifth thing, that you learn out, they shall become one flesh. Means man and woman create one flesh, a child through their union, which precludes a relationship between species that cannot produce offspring. That would be forbidden. Right? Crossbreeding would be forbidden. All forms of bestiality prohibited over here. Whether a person's male or female, or even the active passive partner. Now, we'll throw out a little bit of history. I'm going to try and keep this clean. It's kind of hard with this topic, but we'll try and keep this clean. Maybe we'll get better ratings. And that is that Cleopatra of Mark Antony fame, right? Way back when, now she died, they dropped a horse on her, right? She wanted to have relations with the horse. They propelled this horse up. They got this horse up somehow. They dropped the horse on her and splat. Killed her. So, bestiality, you might think, oh, it's not so in vogue, this, that. Well, it's on the books. That must have been, somewhat common that people did it. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether a person is active or passive. If the person's passive, so what? Still forbidden. If it's done against their will, different issue. That's a different issue. There's a sixth biblical prohibition. Again, these are Torah prohibitions. Incest between siblings. Now, I'm not so clear what the source is, because it says Avimelech said to Abraham, What motivated you to do this thing that you said she's my wife? Sorry, she's my sister. Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God's not in this place. They will slay me on account of my wife. And moreover, she is indeed my sister. It's true. She is my sister, the daughter of my father. Stepsister, but not the daughter of my mother. The stepsister. So what do we learn from here? That a maternal half-sister and even a full sister is prohibited. The question is, how is he allowed to marry her? That's the whole question. But it's going to be forbidden. So the bond of marriage between any of the parents of these siblings, totally irrelevant, because biological relation is enough to establish this prohibition. As the Rambam brings down in the laws of forbidden relations, chapter 2, halachas 2 to 4. Now it's interesting. What does it say over here? It says there's a prohibition of a sister with who you're maternally related. But what about half sisters on the father's side? That's permitted, according to the Rambam. Two different places. So therefore, having the same mother is the base for the biblical definition for siblings for the purpose of this prohibition. Go according to the mother, not the father. And again, there's a whole discussion over here. Some say you learn it out. The Jerusalem Talmud says in Yevamos chapter 11 that prohibition of sibling incest from Genesis chapter 2 verse 24, which we read, with other biblical prohibitions. But there's a whole debate over there whether it applies to all type of siblings or not. What about father and daughter? Another omission over here is relationship between the daughter and her father. Now again, fundamentally, we'd say maybe it's okay. You know, cheaper. You don't have to invite one side of the family to the wedding, right? But the Ramban, the Genesis 19:32, and Rashi Genesis 20, chapter 20, verse 1, right? This practice was banned. Very early days of mankind's repulsive practice. Now, based on that, that's father and daughter. What about brother? We said brother and sister, right? Cain and Abel. One of the things they argued about where Cain killed Abel. Who do they marry? You don't hear anything about their wives, right? So when they were born, they were born with twin sisters. That's who they ended up marrying. Right? Seemingly that wasn't prohibited then. Still wasn't a prohibition. Now, what about a Noahide idolater? So you got the story of Judah and Tamar. Why was Judah able to decree death for Tamar? Right, I want to give her a death penalty. So the Gemara in the Avodah Zarah says, 36b, that in the time of Shem and his court prohibited a Noahide relations and marriages with idolaters. Why? Because, as we see today, how can you build a family based on two-face? Two-face over here. Contradict. One's going to be forced to either assimilate or be subjugated by the other. So Noahide should have married practicing idolaters. And the commentators explain this is held today. Now, this is talking about where Noahide knowingly marries idolater. Let's say a person became a Noahide after already being married. His wife's a Christian, or vice versa. It's not included over here. Right? So, I've got this question a lot just as a side point. Someone becomes a Noahide, when they're married, and their spouse doesn't want to be a Noahide, right? And neither of them want to convert. But what do? I know a number of people in this situation. So you don't have to get divorced. Certainly not. But in most cases, we're not talking about where they got married and they were holding two different places. We're talking about where after they're already married. Now, there are a number of other unions fundamentally permitted, but the Torah says you're not allowed to do it. Right? The Torah calls it an abomination. Right? We mentioned a number of the verses before, have to do with the Canaanites and the Egyptians. Even though permitted, we don't do it. We don't do it. Now, this is a little bit cloudy over here. One is you shouldn't marry your mother's full or maternal half-sister, i.e. your aunt. However, paternal half-sister is completely permitted. Some oaths, some paternal aunts also are called abominations. Right? There is such an opinion. But we're not, not really sure over here. The conclusion is doubtful. No question, should we really be stringent in such a situation? That's just an extra, stringency over here. So whatever, it's a whole question. It's a whole question over here. What about marrying both a woman and her daughter, stepdaughter, let's say? Although fundamentally permitted, we don't do it. It's also called an abomination. Uncle, brother, son's ex-wife. Right? Also going to be technically permitted, but we don't do it. And again, that's only a small list. Small list over here. Could be many other relationships included. So we got a tremendous amount of proof, as the Medrash tells me, that generations after the floods, also there were voluntary prohibitions, in sexual matters. Well, the question is, were they called abominations in the sense like by Egypt and Canaan, that really technically permitted, but we don't do it? So if that's the case, then we would say they're prohibited even by earlier decree, right? That's what we'd have to say. So again, there's a whole question, for many other things as well. Now, what about liability? We mentioned before, well, all these prohibitions apply equally to male and female. Right? We don't discriminate over here. The Talmud tells me they shall become one flesh. So therefore, a woman's maternal half-brother is prohibited to her just as a man's maternal half-sister. Goes both ways. And a woman is prohibited to her son just as a man's mother is prohibited to him. Now, how do we define marriage over here? What's the definition? All right, what's the definition over here? So, we're going to discuss this later, but we need to define marriage as a means by which a woman becomes prohibited to all other men except for her husband. That's what Kiddushin is. In other words, you're sanctified to each other, and you're not allowed to marry anyone else. You're not allowed to be with anybody else unless they get divorced. So the man, by way of marriage, he's going to accept certain obligations. He's going to support, he's going to protect his wife, he's going to give her conjugal rights, so to speak. Could also fall under the law of dinim, of setting up law courts as well. And that could be a legal, expectation for a man to his wife. But again, we define it 100% by the Torah over here. Also, the ideal of marriage, both want the same things. They want to go in the same path. Right? They want to civilize the world, have children. It's an obligation for non-Jews to have children, which we'll speak about. Now, for Noahide, what does it apply? How does it apply over here? So the first thing is that you have status husband and wife, and there are certain prohibitions with this status. In other words, once they make an agreement, right, they're considered betrothed. They make an agreement to be with each other, they're considered betrothed. So therefore, all prohibited relations discussed above take effect. Meaning once they already make that commitment, all these applications apply. Right? All these forbidden prohibitions apply. But you're not liable for punishment yet. Once there's consensual intercourse and that's taken place, then they're liable for transgression and punishment. Before, you might have transgressed, but you're not liable because it wasn't consummated. Once it's consummated, then all the prohibitions come. So now, once these two people fulfill what they're supposed to do, according to the Torah, they're husband and wife. Now, what about a man and woman who live together? Maybe you tell me if they live together, what about common law marriage? They're also considered married. Either never agreed to do so. Right? Many cases they'd be considered married over here. Even if even if they just live together. Right? That would apply both to Jews and non-Jews. But again, the prohibition, the status is implied, we have to see. So therefore, it's not advisable, for them to live together before marriage. Now, I would say like this, statistically, anybody, who's lived together before marriage, the rate of divorce after is very high. Very, very high. If the rate of divorce is, let's say, over 50%, if you live together, it goes up exponentially. I guess, if you get everything for free, maybe it's not so enticing over here, but once, or it's more enticing, but once you got a piece of paper and now it's legal, maybe it's not as much fun anymore. Maybe that might be the case. So, according to Jewish law, there are a number of restrictions or interactions between genders, right? A man and a woman prohibited to each other. If they're prohibited to each other, they can't hug, they can't hold hands, they can't cuss, they can't kiss, can't engage in other expressions of physical intimacy. Doesn't apply to parents, children, and siblings. Parents can certainly kiss their child. Similarly, these people cannot touch each other, can't be alone either. Can't be isolated together in a locked room, let's say. Or it's inaccessible. Now, $1.5 million question. Does this really apply to Noahides? So Minchas Chinuch in Mitzvah 188, he goes through all the mitzvahs of the Torah, and goes into detail who it applies to and who it doesn't. He says it applies that non-Jews shouldn't touch each other either. Right? Someone was prohibited to them. Right? Prohibitions of contact, situations are not safe. It's forbidden. Part of the biblical prohibition. But you don't only transgress over here just by having sex, but by any other pleasurable physical contact. Right? Contact. Now, this is very highly disputed. Right? It's a huge novelty to say such a thing. I understand by Jews. It's one thing, but to say it applies to non-Jews, that's a big novelty. Huge novelty. Goes along the Medrash. Also says it applies to Noahides. Right? Generation after the flood accepted extra precautions because of sexual immorality. But again, can't necessarily use the Medrash as proof because it's not clear they're general precautions or, on physical contact or intimate situations. What do we know? There were precautions between specific partners, but who says it's across the board? Who says it's going to apply to Noahides, in total? No, that's also a little bit of a jump. Comes on the Chavis Yair, in the Chidah, great later commentaries, in the Stei Chemetz, they unequivocally say no. Because I can make a comparison of the laws between relations between Jews and non-Jews, and the laws of relations between Noahides and Noahides. But how can I say that these situations are the same? Right? Very hard to say if this applies to Jews in relations between Jews. How can I say it also applies to non-Jews? Who says it's equal? Right? In other words, if I say that the relations between Jews and non-Jews are the same, then all these restrictions fall on the Jew side, not on the non-Jews. Maybe they only apply to us, not non-Jews. Right? So it's not proof over, not certainly not clear-cut proof. Noahides have no such prohibition. We're gonna see. We're gonna see this, but who says it's the same? Why would I think it's the same? And then you get the mitzvahs Hashem, repeated in the Talmud and other places, that also say, yes, Noahides are forbidden to have contact, create situations, could lead to transgressions. But again, it's a logically compelled practice, not actual Torah obligation. So he makes a very strong point. Because general principle, you can't trust ourselves when it comes to sexual desire. Anyone, I'm going to age myself a little bit. Ray can probably relate to this. Maybe some other people. And that is, if anyone ever saw the movie When Harry Met Sally. Right? In the movie When Harry Met Sally, People of the opposite sex cannot be friends. It just doesn't work. Right? 100% it doesn't work. And if it could lead to something, that's going to lead to that, then it's forbidden. That should be forbidden for non-Jews. Because you can't trust yourself in such a situation. Now, there's a practical motivation over here. Right? And that is that a Noahide can practice them even according to the Jewish laws. Right? And it's a good thing. It's a strong moral imperative, over here. Now, the problem is over here that you're right. We would agree they have to determine their own boundaries. They have to have their own set of guidelines. Right? But to say that it's the same and it applies equally, it's a big jump. It's a very, very big jump. Right? For example, Noahide should only use Jewish law to determine what is permitted to them in those areas, not what is forbidden. In other words, the doctor seeing a female patient in the examining room, and they're alone, the door is shut. That's permitted for Jews. It's only going to be permitted for Noahides, right? Someone can walk in at any time, right? Whatever. Also, there are socially acceptable forms of greetings, right? Handshakes. Fundamentally permitted for Jews, always permitted for Noahides. But what about prohibitions? Prohibitions over here, again, we have to be sensible. That if a wife would just have to trust her husband, or a husband would have to trust his wife, what does that mean? I need precaution. And that's Noahide's going to have to determine. For instance, a man taking a business trip with a married female co-worker, red flag, major red flag. Girl living in a college dorm. Now, technically, premarital intimacy is permitted for Noahides. But again, we should probably be strict. I would say it's a moral imperative. Woman allowing another man into her home for a social visit if her husband's out of town. Also, a little bit dodgy, as the English would say. Right, a man sleeping or sharing a room with a man who's suspected of homosexual desires or activity. Also bad. Handshakes, again, we said, permissible. But contact that implies intimacy shouldn't be had. Right? That should be forbidden. Again, there will be normal exceptions, of love between immediate family members. And again, got to be careful with that as well. That's going to be a whole discussion. There's going to be a whole discussion as well. But a lot of these things, even, for a Jewish male, a woman puts out her hand, right? You're not allowed to shake it, right? You have to give up your life before you shake it. So even if it's a fish handshake, even if you had a glove on, and you're shaking the hand of the queen, right? You're not allowed to. Doesn't matter if it's a handshake or not. It's not intimate, right? For us, it's totally forbidden. Not allowed to touch someone who's forbidden to us of the opposite sex. Now, a Noahide, maybe I'd say it's not a problem. Something that's permitted, okay. But I'm not going to say it's forbidden for Jews, also forbidden for non-Jews. But I would say, even if it's not forbidden, maybe it's a moral imperative. Right? And a moral imperative is pretty important. Right? Premarital sex, as we said, should be okay. 100% should be okay for non-Jews. But who says it's good? That, if anyone ever saw the movie When Harry Met Sally, that always gets in the way. Physicality gets in the way. That's why, certainly, by us, when our, children, looking for a spouse, they meet, they don't touch till after they get married. Because that always gets in the way. You can say, but how do you know they're going to be compatible? They'll figure it out. Biology 101. Right? It's important. I'm not going to say not. Right? But you also have to get along. You have to have the same goals, same desires. There's a difference between, as Rav Noach Weinberg of blessed memory, the head of the Yeshiva of Torah, said there's a difference between love and infatuation. Love, everyone would agree, in our circles comes after marriage. Most people, I shouldn't say most, a lot of people, when they meet, it's infatuation. But how do people meet in general? And how do things happen? Most likely when they've been drinking. I'm not going to say all the time. They always meet in a bar. But again, a person has less inhibitions. I don't think that's good. I mean, that's what happens because you have less inhibitions. But that always gets in the way. Always gets in the way. But see, once you're married, and if you date, and you're discussing, philosophical issues, other things, practical things, you want to see, the main thing is you want to see if you're compatible. You have to be attracted to the opposite sex, right? 100% you have to be attracted. You have to see, if you have the same goals, the same desires. Now, you can't always know how a person's going to be under pressure. There's a story, guy's taking out a girl, driving along, they stop at a red light, girl pulls out the keys from the ignition. Meanwhile, the light turns green, everyone's beeping, everyone's honking, like no tomorrow, and the guy's like, can I please have the keys? And she's not giving it to him. And people are honking and yelling, can I please have the keys? Light turns red. Guy's getting, a little more flustered. And finally, she gives him the keys. So the guy asks, as they're driving along, why in the world did you do that? Like, what was the purpose over here? So what'd she do? She wanted to test him. She wanted to test him under pressure. Right? So she tells him, I wanted to see how you act under pressure. Because you can't tell how a person's going to act under pressure. Life throws all kinds of things at us. Nobody knows how they're going to act under pressure. Or you might not be able to tell. So she tells him, I just want you to know you passed the test. You passed the test. The guy said, that's great. You failed. I'm taking you home. That was the end of the date. Right? So how can you know how a person acts? You can't. You're not going to know that. Right? There could be red flags. Someone could give away certain things that, then a person could see. But you're not necessarily going to see how a person acts under pressure. You don't know. You have no idea. Right? But what's your hunch based on you're going to marry someone? The hunch is based on what you feel when you're around them. How you interact. You always have what to speak about. I mean, a lot of things. A lot of things. It's not easy to commit. I mean, it's a big commitment here. Right? But again, you're not clouded. You're not clouded by physicality. And that can definitely cloud a relationship. Yeah, so I guess we're going to continue with this next week. Anybody have any questions on any of that? All right. You can unmute yourself if you want to do that. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Rabbi. Let me, I'm sorry. Oh, I see which one came off. I just need to, take myself.
Echo.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm trying to, how do I get out of here? Okay, real quick. I just, there, leave meeting. Okay. So, I'm stepping outside. I have a situation where, well, there are two questions. One I wanted to write you about earlier, but I don't know if we would be able to do it without recording. So it might be better to email. I just haven't I haven't been able to yet. But one of them, kind of to do with this, it kind of has later. So when I married my wife,
Right.
I at that time I wanted to be a Jew. I wanted
Right.
to convert, and I was telling her unknowingly in my ignorance, I was telling her, well, you have to too in order for us to be together.
Right.
And at a certain point, she learned about what a Noahide was, and she said, hey, why don't we do that? And
Right.
that's what originally got me interested in being a Noahide.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened was later on, she ended up becoming a Christian.
Okay.
Going back to being a Christian, my son
Right.
was very, very young, like, I don't know, maybe 3 years old or but it created problems in the long run. We have a peace, going on, but in between, there were years where she really tried to convince me doing it with him.
Right.
He laid. I'll just say he's in a status where he's not a Christian, nor is he a Noahide.
Right.
But yeah, it caused problems in the long run.
Right. But if you got married at the outset based on that, meaning that you were of two different faiths, that's more of a problem. But at this point, that you came in and you decided whatever you decided, and she decided, that's a different issue, right? That's a totally different issue. That's not something the person has to get divorced for. I mean, a number of cases like this, and there's no obligation to try and convince her to be a Noahide. If she wants to be a Christian, okay, that's her choice. That doesn't mean you have to try and convince her. You can try and educate your kids the best way possible. But this is the problem, right? This is definitely the problem that you're going to run into, is that you're not at the same level. You're not holding the same, in the same place. But it would be worse. Let's say it would be a lot worse if you came into the marriage that way. That's an issue. Then that's what we're talking about, marrying an idolater. But most cases, it's not that way. Most cases, just the opposite. Person came into it after marriage, right? Now, let's say a person came into it after marriage, and one of the spouses, goes to a false religion. Okay, it can also happen, right? Does that mean a person has to get divorced? No, doesn't mean that. There's going to be mixed signals, that's for sure. It could be you want to just be an Noahide, she wants to take her kids to church, that or whatever, or be a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever. That's going to cause problems for sure. But I knew somebody that, still know them. They had serious problems. In other words, he became a Noahide, and for a long time, his wife was in her family a bunch of I don't know if they born again Christians or whatever they were. They tormented this guy. Really tormented him, and he didn't get divorced. And after a while, she finally opened up a little bit. He was able to show her a few things, and as they say, the rest was history. So she's not a Christian anymore. But this person went through, a lot of pain, a lot of ridicule, and if a person's going to agree to disagree, and keep the peace, okay. If not, that's a different issue. Right. In other words, this is going to be constantly fighting. I would, in these cases, I wouldn't tell a person got an obligation to get divorced by any stretch. Right. But it does get, what's the word? A little bit dicey. It does get hard because, kids are involved and you want to keep the peace and all that. And, people are very emotionally charged. I know somebody who converted. I don't know the whole story, but he converted. His wife wanted no part of it. He got divorced. And he said, I'm happy I converted. I'm happy I'm part of the Jewish people, but he paid a price. He paid a serious price. He said he's happy he went through the process and what he did. But he wouldn't necessarily recommend other people to do it. So it's hard. I don't have any good answers. But it's a hard thing. If the peace is kept, no one's stepping on each other's toes. And yeah, I can understand a person doesn't want their spouse being in idolatry and all that. That's true. That might be a very hard thing to fathom in your kids and whatever. But, on the other hand, it's not your mission to try and bring her out of it. Right? Non-Jews don't have a mission to go to other non-Jews and try and convince them. It's certainly not our mission. We're here to teach, if non-Jews come to us, so to speak. But there's no mitzvah for me to try and bring a non-Jew closer to his mitzvahs. None. Now, they'll say, but what about what you do? So I tell people what I do. That's fine. People can choose or not choose. I'm not running after people. They can make their own choice. But, at the end of the day, they might pay a price. And a marriage could be a serious price. The question is, there have to be boundaries. Definitely have to be boundaries. And I know somebody that, was going to get divorced anyway, and they wanted to convert, their spouse didn't. And normally I would never tell anyone, to do that, but they were getting divorced anyway, so it was a moot point. That's what they ended up doing anyway. And this, if neither's going to convert or they can't convert, even though someone's into idolatry, that doesn't make it prohibited here, right? It just means you got to figure out, a plan of how you're going to, work that aspect out, which is definitely not an easy one. I know I can't be more vague than that.
Okay. And sorry. Oh, I hit my head. Oh no, I came outside. I hope that a warning not to talk about it. My other question, I came outside because my family members would never understand.
Right.
But it's about, and that's the reason I was asking if we could do it without being recorded. I'm going to take a risk and ask anyway. Okay. With family members, from my
if a person, let's say, was born under, let's say the person can be born, let's say, under a certain what's it called, certain mazal, certain zodiac, whatever, that has power, has influence, so to speak. Let's say a person was born under the sign of Mars. Right? Sign of Mars, what does it mean? It means that a person more susceptible to blood. What does it mean, blood? Meaning to kill. So what should a person do if that's the case? So they should be a ritual slaughterer. They should be a ritual slaughterer. They should be a moil. They should do circumcision. Because they're more susceptible to this. Now, does that mean, that just means you have to channel it in a different way, right? In a totally different way over here. That's what has to be done. So if that's true, I would say in this curse, a person would have to work really, really hard to uproot it. Individuals can uproot it, potentially. Right? The majority are not going to. The majority are going to get demolished. That's what's going to happen. That's what we see. That's what we see from Africa. We see in general. It's just nothing's ever become of that country, that continent. Nothing. That's the curse. Now, does that mean everybody can't overcome it? No. It means their individuals probably can. But again, they have to be in certain circumstances and how it's going to work. And, across the board, they might be able to. Some people. But you're right. If a person becomes a Noahide, that wouldn't apply. That definitely, wouldn't apply. But again, that means you have to be super duper and you have to keep everything and you have to be so careful and you have to this, you have to that. I wouldn't necessarily say that. Right? But if you're going in the right path, that should take care of the problem. But a lot of people don't want to go in the right path and they get stuck. That's what happens. But an individual works hard. So too by a Jew, if they're stuck underneath this certain zodiac or whatever that has a lot of influence, you have to work really, really hard to uproot it. Doesn't mean it's impossible. A person's going to be limited. It's going to be hard for them, but they can do it. It's possible. So same thing by Noahide, no difference. That wouldn't make any difference. Also have to work hard. But again, does that mean you have to be picture perfect? No. All it means is, you got to work hard, you got to strive, you got to do what you need to do, and that should help. Right? 100%, that should help.
Okay. Also, a lot of secular scholars, I guess.
Yeah.
They would try, and I could see it. I could see it in the sense of character, but a lot of secular scholars try to say that the Egyptians were so advanced and they gave so much to society, but at the same time they were severely immoral. And they worship beetles. It's ridiculous. They worship dogs, cats, beetles, and I don't want to be something too.
What's the point?
Okay, so what how did that affect them specifically, or did it affect them in a different way? Or because
what we said over here is that they were totally steeped in immorality, right? We have all these prohibitions of forbidden relationships based on what they did and how disgusting they were. We mentioned how Cleopatra died, right? God wiped them out. It's interesting that the Jews had to go there to be part of that, see what went on in that country. And they almost got demolished spiritually. Right? They almost weren't taken out. If they weren't taken out, they would have disappeared. 100% they would have disappeared. Spiritually. They would have reached the 8th level, the 40th level of impurity. Right? They would have disappeared spiritually. But what do you see? You can see that there are societies, certainly like the Romans. How did the Romans get destroyed? Because they were decadent. They were rotten from within. Corrupt, immoral, all the good things. Right? So they got demolished. Eventually. Totally got demolished from within. So these things, you can see that what the Egyptians did, and they're a good example. And Sodom, look how bad Sodom was, and God just wiped them off the face of the map. They were immoral. They stole. They did all kinds of terrible things. But why did God wipe them out? Because society couldn't sustain it. There's no possible way. In other words, if you steal a little bit from someone, you're not liable. You steal a little bit more, you're not liable. That someone else does it. Then you can steal everything from everybody. That society can't stand. There was other things going on as well. Plenty of other things. But why was the seal over here, especially by the floods, why was the seal that they were destroyed because of stealing? Because life couldn't survive. Society couldn't survive. But when you have immorality running wild, and you have same-sex marriages sanctioned by contract, that is a recipe for disaster. What you see going on in the U.S. right now is a disaster for immorality. So what's going to happen? They're going to get flushed, and they are getting flushed. All kinds of inflation, other things, right? America's on the way down, no question about it. But it's not just these are individual acts. Don't make the mistake and say, oh, this is random. It's totally not random. There's a connection to immorality and the downfall of a country. Start by the Greeks, start by the Romans, start by others. Immorality will destroy a country from within. But to sanction it legal, that's already beyond. That's already well beyond. Right? So, Egypt had terrible things going on. Totally immoral. Totally corrupted. So you learn out a lot of prohibitions based on what they did. Based on all these immoral acts. All these abominations you learn from them. Them and the Canaanites. That's why they had to be so severely punished and wiped out. Because you can't have that in the land of Israel. Gotta wipe them out. Can't have it. You're gonna tell me Tel Aviv's capital of the gays today? Big problem. As my Rebbe would say, it's not about the missiles. Right? It's about people who sin in the land of Israel. But you're gonna do that? Make that the capital? There's gonna be payback, God forbid. God forbid. That's what uproots. That's what brings out God's ire. That's what it does. Totally brings out. How did Bilam get the Jewish people to sin? Immorality. That's how he got them destroyed. 24,000 people. He couldn't curse them. He couldn't do other things. But what does God hate more than anything else? Immorality. And God will punish absolutely severely for immorality. You think it's a coincidence? This whole monkeypox thing, whether you hold by it or not, claiming who's getting it the most, gays? Someone told me years ago with AIDS. They said, if you're going to tell me it's because, it's a punishment for gay people and this and that, well, you got a better idea? That's not random. Okay, drug abusers got it also. Sharing needles, okay. But what community was hit the most? They're not just bashing gays. These are the facts on the ground. Facts on the ground. They got affected the most. So, someone wants to say, wow, that's an interesting coincidence. Yeah, it is. You got a better explanation? Let's hear another explanation. I think that's pretty direct. Right? Many years ago, as we did this first video I mentioned homosexuality. In Miami, what bar got shot up? A gay bar. You think that was random? I don't think it was random. Don't think it was random. I'd have a parade here. I don't think it was random. Could have hit any bar. Any bar. Right? Why did they hit that bar specifically? Because God wanted to make a point. Measure for measure. Right? You're going to walk around, prance around, in the Holy Land. God's going to say, yeah, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you. Some people say, it should have happened in Israel, this, that, whatever. But it happened straight thereafter. God's sending a message. He's sending a message, direct message. Whether we want to see it or we don't want to see it. Doesn't matter. So, that's the world we live in. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Totally unfortunate. But, people aren't going to get it. They're not going to see direct relation. They'll never admit it, certainly not in public. They get tarred and feathered because they're not politically correct. Guess what? We don't have to be politically correct here. Telling the truth is what the truth is. But if you see something direct like that, right? You see it direct like that. Direct connection. You do this, you're going to get this. If you're not careful. So how can you say that's not direct? Why is it one sector of society is getting it more than others? Oh, that's a coincidence. Yeah, it is. It's a big coincidence. That seems direct punishment. That seems measure for measure. You're going to act in this way. God says, I'll take care of business this way. That's why God had to uproot the Egyptians. And that's why we have all these, when we talk about all these abominations, and different things, learn it out from them because they exemplified it. They worked it. They did it. They, all that. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more about what you were just saying. I live in California, which is scary.
Right.
And because of family obligations, I can't really leave. But there are of Americans. I don't want to say half, but a lot of Americans who are with their politics, they say, no, you're not going to do this to our children, et cetera, and they are with the gender confusion thing.
Right.
I as a substitute teacher, and I have a really hard time with my job because of it. I've seen like first graders, second graders, a boy dressed like a girl, and their parents are doing this to them.
Right.
For the
I
fact
grew up in Boston, they're doing it in third grade already, teaching this stuff, second grade, third grade. It's crazy. Yeah.
And so for those of us who are, strong against it, like Governor DeSantis in Florida, on that issue, how does that affect us with the wrath that is coming down on America?
No, so people have to protest. People have to show that it's wrong, right? The ones that, show it's wrong, say it's wrong, God should protect them, right? There are times, even whatever the repercussions are, there may be repercussions, negative repercussions, but guess what? You can't sit around and say it's okay, right? Job, there were 3 people who gave advice to Pharaoh, right? Yisro, Jethro, Moshe's father-in-law, he said they shouldn't do anything. He fled. Right? Bilam said you should enslave them and kill them. He was killed. Job didn't say anything. He got Yisurim. He got punished. He suffered. Right? Why? Because he should have spoken up. If he's quiet, it's like he agreed. There are things we can't agree. Even if it may cost us. It could cost the person their job. Right? The question is the Torah true or it's not true? So we say, of course the Torah is true. We understand the Torah is true. We understand the Torah is true. Then we might have to pay a price to keep it. I'll give one example. A person's boss wants you to have certain information. If you give it over, it's Lashon Hara. Boss says if you don't give me over that information, you're fired. You got to quit. You can't give over that information. So you got to say, but that's the merit for keeping Torah? You find another job. Even if it's hard. God will take care of you because you stood up for Torah. You don't lose out. But if you have an opportunity to say something you don't, you just go in, the repercussions could be what they are. For a non-Jew, all these things we just mentioned are all forbidden. Torah prohibition, liable for death penalty. A co-worker is getting married to someone of the same sex. You're not allowed to say, you're not allowed to say congratulations. You're not allowed to say mazel tov. It's forbidden. Even for non-Jews. They don't like it. Tell them to go eat kugel. Who cares if they don't like it? So you're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of someone. You're not allowed to say something you can't say. Can I say mazel tov to a Jew marries a non-Jew? No. Some people are still upset. I wouldn't say it. And I wouldn't say congratulations. Because you can't congratulate someone who's doing an abomination. Who's doing a terrible thing against God. So to this day, they'll have claims against. 100% they'll have claims. Because I won't be politically correct. Okay. I don't need them anyway. Right? But in the end, there are certain things you can't do. You just can't do it, period. So therefore, you may pay a price. There may be a price. Someone says, well, say this, or you're going to lose your job. Even as a non-Jew, you'd have to lose your job. It's not going to come to that. But, you can't say it's okay. You can't ship in for a gift for their wedding. You can't have anything to do with it. Now, you get made fun of, they disrespect it, okay? Let them disrespect it, but you're standing up for Torah. If you don't say anything, there's a Talmudic dictum. It's called shtika kahoda, dummy. Shtika means you're quiet. It's as if I agree. It doesn't matter if they're not going to listen. Right? So, person may have to rebuke them. Probably apply to a Jew, not necessarily a non-Jew. Right? But you might have to give rebuke. What you might have to do. If they don't like it, it makes life uncomfortable. Okay. Let me ask you the $1.5 million question. Would you rather look uncomfortable in the eyes of God or in the eyes of man? I would think the latter. Let them make fun of you. Let them say things. Right? I'll give one example, then I got to run to another class. And that is, someone told me, right, this person was Jewish, guy was Jewish, wife isn't Jewish. Right? So his kids aren't Jewish. So they have a son that married a non-Jewish girl, thank God. It's a non-Jewish girl. So what does this person say to get under my skin? A little bit. They say, they got married. They didn't mention God at the wedding. Right? My answer was? Okay. They don't have to mention God at the wedding. Because if the two non-Jews and they live together as Noahides, guess what? They don't need to be married. Legally. We just mentioned that. I wasn't going to explain that to them. Would have gone straight over their head. They're like, what's a no? This, that, forget it. My answer was, okay. Sit there and listen to this nonsense. They didn't even speak about God. Well, they don't have to. You idiot. They don't have to. They don't have to have this document. They don't have nothing. All they have to do is live together. They're married. They walk out, they get divorced. Very good. You're going to get under my skin? You're not going to get under my skin. Because it's a ludicrous statement that you're making. So when someone has an agenda, you don't have to answer them. Just like in the Haggadah. Right? The evil son. You don't give him an answer. Right? You don't give him an answer. You blunt his teeth. Why don't you give him an answer? He's not interested in an answer. He's got an agenda. And had he been there, he would have been redeemed. Gonna give him an answer for what? He's gonna make fun of me. Okay? I'll take it one step further. I had a family member once say, if I breathe on your food, is it not kosher? So I said, no, it's just got bad breath on it. Right, what an idiotic statement. You're going to get under my skin? You know nothing. So what are they going to do? I'm also Jewish. I'm just as Jewish. Because I don't follow it, doesn't matter. Okay? You're not asking me anything. You're telling me you got an agenda. I'm okay. Well, you're not okay. You're married to a non-Jew. You're not going to get around that issue. You are not going to get around that issue unless you get divorced or non-Jewish spouse converts. But see, it's interesting. You read the book of Esther, right? Haman, Mr. Haman himself, a lot of money, a lot of power, unbelievable wealth. One person refuses to bow down to him, not worth anything because he knows the truth. The secular Jews, deep down, they know the truth also. It's that you represent the truth. They don't want to hear it. You don't have to say anything. Someone once told me, a Jewish doctor once told me, I'm offended by the way you dress. I'm like, what's the problem with the way I dress? You and I dress the same, except I have a white shirt, usually. I'm wearing tzitzis and I wear a hat and a jacket. Why are they offended? Because of what it represents. Because you're saying I'm not good enough. I didn't say anything. I didn't say that. You're insinuating I said that. I didn't say anything. Right? People have an inferiority complex. They, for a Jew, they got that spark. They know what the truth is. They just don't want to do it. And they don't want to keep it. They want to be free. So what do? They make fun, they scoff, this, that, but they don't know anything. They don't know anything. So it's ironic, because they spew all this stuff without knowing nothing. That's highly offensive. One thing, you did the research. Right? You did the research of one thing. You got information, you got claims, valid claims, okay. Let's have a discussion, let's look at sources. But you talk out of your elbow, which most people do, and they get louder and louder. It's very easy to just knock them off. But sometimes you got to say something, even if it's unpopular. I've done it, a number of times, but okay. If I come out smelling like a rose, I listen to my rabbis, told me what to do, okay. I didn't necessarily come out smelling like a rose. But I did what I had to do. People don't want to hear what, I don't care what you think. So why are you getting upset? I'm a minority. You're going to call me a fruitcake, this and that, but they know deep down. They know deep down you got something, but they're not going to look into it because they don't want to change. And they want to keep their lives. They don't want to feel guilty eating something they're not allowed to eat. They say, yeah, you're a fanatic, you're this, you're that, you're the other thing. And they scoff and they make fun. Okay, we'll see who laughs last. But yeah, a person may have to say something. It might be uncomfortable. Okay, where would you rather be more uncomfortable? In this world or in the next? So on that note, I'm going to stop here. If you have any other questions, you can certainly email me. Otherwise, I'm going to sign out. Wish everyone a good middle of the day or almost end of the day for me. And everyone have a great rest of the week.
You are currently the only person in this conference.